Welcome to Bo Beats, my name is Bo, and in this video we are taking a look at this beautiful synthesizer by Electron, the Analog 4 Mark II. So maybe you're new to the Analog 4, let me just give you a brief overview. The Analog 4 is, as its name suggests, a 4-voice analog synthesizer. Those 4 voices can be used in polyphonic mode, so you can play chords up to 4 notes, but you can also use them as 4 separate mono voices that can also be sequenced using the internal sequencer. You can sequence chords, polychords, you can sequence mono voices and combinations of the two. So it's a flexible synth engine. What makes the Analog 4 super interesting is the same that makes most Electron products very appealing. It's that you can make it your own. There's so much you can change on it. There's so much versatility. Just to name a few things, the Analog 4 Mark II is a synthesizer that can do mono sounds like this. But it's not just for synth sounds, it's actually a very capable drum machine. You can create your own percussive sounds and sequence them and use them just like a drum machine. Like this, for example. So let me go over some of the new things with the Analog 4 Mark II. Well, obviously there's a new color. It has this matte gray finish and it's really pleasing to the eye. I must say it looks a lot better than on the images. And the secondary functions of the buttons are actually in what I call a kind of military green, which works really nicely with the overall gray finish. Now there's also a difference here on the sides where you can actually much more easily grip the unit and move it about, and that makes a lot of sense if you want to, for example, use this in your lap, sitting perhaps like I do downstairs in my sofa, just playing around on it. Another new thing is the improved screen. It's an OLED panel, it looks really nice and sharp, it's easy to view from different angles. It conveys a lot of information in a nice way, because on the Mark I units the screens were sort of a weak point. They were hard to read from an angle. There was so much information that was supposed to be conveyed on this tiny little, I think it was an LCD display if I'm not mistaken. And while it worked, I can totally see why a new screen would be a big selling point to a lot of people. The knobs are of course also new. They have the same kind of quality feel as the Digitact knobs, and coming from the Mark I units, moving over to the Digitact and going back to the Mark I units, that Mark I units knobs did feel a little bit sluggish compared to the Digitacts. So I really enjoy having these faster, more, more precise knobs than on the Mark I units. Because even though they are, they're very sensitive, once you get the feel for them, it's much easier to dial in small differences, which is a lot of fun and it's very important as well for the overall Electron workflow. And speaking about knobs, we also have this dedicated knob. It's a new feature. It's a quick performance controller. Basically what it lets you do is when you press the Q per or quick performance button here, you can access one of the 10 performance macros. So basically you press this button and you select something let me show you how it works. We'll go into a pattern here with a drum groove, cue performance, let's set number 1 here, and let's press play. So when I'm turning the button here, or the knob rather, I introduce changes to the pitch of one of the sounds. And of course you can have access to all 10 of them if you just go into the performance setup here, the perf button here. You have access to all the 10 different performance macros. So basically the quick performance knob here makes it so that you always have a quick way to access one of the macros, which in turn gives this unit a much more faster workflow, especially for live performances, which I think is really nice. And speaking about the buttons are the same as on the Digitact, and for me personally, I do prefer them to the Mark I buttons. I feel that there's a little bit more of a tactile feedback, so I know when a button has been pressed or not, which is kind of important on this type of synthesizer. And speaking on the button placement, we talked about the performance button here and the performance setup. A lot of the buttons have been rearranged or shifted around. They have a new place, or there's even new buttons. So these buttons over here, the kit, the sound, the mix, the track, the pattern, the song, are all new buttons that were previously secondary functions to the keyboard. Now this makes a lot of sense. Firstly, because you suddenly have a keyboard that you only use for basically one thing. You also have the dedicated octave buttons over here that are very nice to kind of interact with the keyboard in a much more much more quick and flexible way. But let's go back to these buttons here. The reason why these buttons are so important is because suddenly you have a function. Well, let me phrase it like this. Suddenly, instead of these buttons being secondary functions to the actual keyboard, these buttons here now lets you access another layer of functions with the function and kit. Lets you go into the kit menu, and the function and sound lets you go into the sound settings, the function and mix, lets you poly configure. The function and track lets you set up the metronome. The function and pattern lets you set up pattern and swing. The function and song shows you the different songs you have saved, so or saving songs. And those functions were not as easy to access on the Mark I units, which I think is really nice on the Mark II. So instead of having, for example, kit, a secondary function on a button over here, you have kit as a dedicated button. You just press it and you can load and you can save the kits. And sound, you can go to the sound browser, sound manager, and so on. All the menus are the same as on the Mark I. It's just a way that you access them much quicker. There is also a new fill button over here. Now, on the Mark I units, you did have fill. It came with the 1.24 update, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm mistaken. But it was an addition to the Mark I units a year or so ago, if I'm not mistaken. And what you did was you pressed the yes and the page button to enable the fill. Or rather, I think you held the page button to enable the fill, but if you wanted to cycle it so the fill mode enabled the next pattern, you just held yes and page. Now this has been changed. You now have a dedicated fill button over here. So let me show you, for example. Let's go into a drum groove here. Now press function and fill. Function and fill. Or you just hold it. So you still have the option to hold it, but you can also cue the fill. And this also makes a lot of sense. Now you have a fill button, you understand what it does. It enables the fill conditions on the trigs. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. We'll probably go over that in a different video, but you can also cue it, which is really nice. And this also ties into a more live friendly workflow where you actually have access to a quick performance, basically a performance macro. You have access to that with this knob here, and you also have access to the fills here very quickly. So you can do something like this. So going back to the buttons, we have, of course, if we go to an image of the Mark I, you can see that there's a lot more going on the Mark II unit. We have the dedicated fill. We don't have secondary function on the keys here. We have the octave buttons. We have a different transpose button over here. The performance key has been shifted from over here to here. You have the kind of the settings button here for saving projects, the settings for a particular kit and sound, and the polyconfig, and you have the mixer readily available here as well. So that's, of course, a big difference, and it does make a lot of sense. Now, I've said it makes a lot of sense many times, but that's kind of where I'm getting at. All these buttons and having chain and song here as dedicated buttons that you can enable, going into chain mode, going into song mode very quickly. It's important because the Electron workflow might seem a little bit daunting to a beginner. So having these dedicated buttons makes it much easier to quickly find something. For example, say you want to save a sound. You just press the sound, you go to Sound Manager, for example, you pick an empty slot where you want to save it. Oh, I have to scroll down a bit because I've saved many sounds already. And you go to Save Track Sound. And it just makes a little bit more sense. There's just a more quick access to some functions that were previously a little bit harder to find. And just having the kind of feedback that you get when the chain is activated, you can see very clearly the chain is active, which is very important, so you don't, for example, accidentally jump from one pattern to another, deleting something, or if you're playing live, you surely want to see if a chain is active or not. That's for sure. And as you might remember from the beginning of the video, you saw me chaining some patterns together into a little song. With the chaining of patterns, with the song mode, with the countless options for changing up the sounds from pattern to pattern or even from step to step, you can really create some complex music on this synthesizer. So I say it's not so much a synth as a groove box or workstation, because you can make it your own. If you just wanted to play chords or monophonic sounds, sure, you can make it a traditional synth. But if you want it to become something else, you want it to become like a drum machine or a groove box, or you want it to add effects to external synths, or you want it to sequence stuff via CV, or you want CV to modulate the sounds on it, you can do it. There's so much customizability in this synthesizer. Now another really big thing on this unit is of course the new CV inputs. Previously you had the CV channel here that could send the control voltages to say a Eurorack system from a dedicated sequencer channel, but now you actually have two expression pedal or CV inputs. And these external inputs lets you manipulate sound on the analog 4 itself. So basically what you do is you plug something in to the back and you have to set it up so it's not recognized as an expression pedal. You set it up so it's recognized as a CV input. And then you go to kit menu here, kit menu, and down here you scroll down, you have control in mod, control in 2 mod. That corresponds to the inputs 1 and 2. Go into press yes. And what you're seeing now is basically very similar to, say, a performance macro. You can choose by clicking on these encoders what track you want to affect. So the input, CV input number 1 affects a track. You can have the same track for everything. You can have the FX track as well. And then by turning the, for example, number A here, you can choose between a number of different destinations that you want to affect. Say I want to affect, the reverb send or the panning with control voltage. And then you set an amount. So that's basically how you set this up. Now I haven't tested it through and through yet. I've tried it a little bit, seems to work really nicely. But as you can imagine, this opens it up not only so that the Analog 4 Mark II can send CV somewhere, it can also receive CV as a new way to manipulate the onboard sound. So that's very cool indeed, and I'll definitely do a video showcasing this more as well. And something that's also new is of course that you have stereo outputs for the different voices. This is also something that the Mark I didn't have, and it can be very useful. For example, if you don't want to use overbridge and you want individual outputs, or you want to use individual outputs in a live setting. It's also important to note that you can still use the unit also to input sound into it and have the sound go through the effect section, for example. That's still in here as well. So this was my first look at the Analog 4 Mark II. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was a little bit longer than usual, but I wanted to get everything in there. Now there'll be more videos, more sound demos, jamming videos. I'll probably do some live streams with this one as well, so don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell button down there as well so you get a notification whenever I live stream and upload. And you can always check me out over on patreon.com/bowbeats, because it's thanks to you guys over there that I'm able to invest so much time in making these videos. So this was Bo from Bowbeats, and I hope you have a pleasant day. Kan man ha den under här? Kan det funka? Wow! Ja, det var ju kanske världens sämsta idé.